May 13th, 1981. St. Peter's Square, Vatican. A man dressed in white greets the crowd. Suddenly, the sound of gunshots echoes. The Pope falls, seriously wounded. The world holds its breath. Years later, the same man, who miraculously survived, would say, "It was one hand that fired, but another hand guided the bullet." This is the story of Karol Wojtyla, the boy who lost everything, the laborer who defied the Nazis, and the Pope who changed the world with the power of faith and forgiveness. Who was St. John Paul II? For millions, he was the Pilgrim Pope, God's athlete who traveled the entire world, bringing a message of hope to 129 countries. For others, he was the Pope of the family and the creator of World Youth Days, a spiritual father who knew how to speak to the hearts of young people like no one else. But before becoming the leader of over 1 billion Catholics, he was Lolek, a Polish boy born in a land marked by suffering, who learned early on the meaning of loss and perseverance. His life was an extraordinary journey, forged in the fire of the greatest tragedies of the 20th century, but illuminated by an unwavering faith in God and in humanity. A faith that taught him never to be afraid. Let's get to know the story of the man who consecrated himself entirely to Mary, to belong entirely to Christ, and who, with his courage, changed the course of history. Our story begins on May 18, 1920, in the small town of Wadowice, southern Poland. There, Karol Józef Wojtyla was born, whom family and friends affectionately called Lolek. He was the youngest son of Karol Wojtyla Sr., a lieutenant in the Polish army, and Emilia Kaczorowska, a woman of deep faith and sweetness. The first great trial of his life came too soon. In 1929, when Lolek was just 9 years old, his mother Emilia passed away due to heart and kidney problems. It was a devastating blow. Years later, as Pope, he would recall that day when his father took him to church and, pointing to the image of Our Lady, said, "Lolek, from today, this is your mother." Those words marked the beginning of a Marian devotion that would define his entire life. Tragedy would strike the family again 3 years later. His older brother, Edmund, a doctor, contracted scarlet fever from a patient and died heroically in the line of duty. At 12, Lolek had already lost his mother and the only brother he had known. Only he and his father remained, an austere man but of immense faith, who became his greatest companion and mentor. Karol's father was fundamental to his upbringing. Every night, they prayed together, read the Bible, and books on Polish history. It was his father who taught him discipline, love for his homeland, and above all, a personal and profound faith. It was a childhood of losses, but also of a paternal love that sustained him and shaped his resilient character. Pause. Despite the pain, Lolek was a young man full of life. A brilliant student, passionate about literature and poetry, an athlete who loved playing soccer as a goalkeeper, swimming in rivers, and skiing in the Tatra Mountains. Wadowice was a vibrant town where Catholics and a large Jewish community lived in harmony. Karol's best childhood friend was a Jew, Jerzy Kluger. They studied together, played together. This fraternal coexistence from an early age planted in his heart the seeds of dialogue and interreligious respect, a hallmark of his future pontificate. In 1938, with a promising future ahead, Karol moved to the vibrant city of Krakow to study Polish literature and philology at the prestigious Jagiellonian University. He immersed himself in his studies, participated in poetry groups, and above all, dedicated himself to his great passion, theater. For him, theater was not just entertainment. It was a way to explore the human soul and the great questions of life. But this dream was brutally interrupted. On September 1st, 1939, Nazi Germany invaded Poland, marking the beginning of World War II. Krakow, the cultural heart of the country, was occupied. The university was closed. Professors were arrested and sent to concentration camps. Polish culture, language, and national identity itself all became targets to be destroyed. In the face of oppression, Polish resistance took many forms. For Karol and his friends, the weapon would not be the rifle, but the word. They founded the Rhapsodic Theater, an underground theater that performed secretly in apartments. They did not stage direct political protest plays, which would have been suicidal. Instead, they recited the great classics of Polish poetry and drama. It was an act of cultural resistance, a way to keep the soul of the nation alive, to remind the people who they were when the occupiers wanted them to forget. For Carol, the word had the power to affirm human dignity against barbarism. To avoid deportation for forced labor in Germany, Carol was forced to work. First in a quarry, breaking stones under the sun and snow. Then at the Solvay chemical factory. It was exhausting work, which gave him a profound sense of perseverance and a lifelong connection to the world of workers. He saw in his colleagues the nobility and dignity that the oppressors tried to deny. Pause. It was in this environment of extreme suffering, seeing death up close every day, that a new vocation began to emerge in his heart. He saw evil in its rawest form and felt a call for a more radical response. In 1941, his father passed away, leaving him completely alone in the world. This final loss, amidst the chaos of war, led him to a definitive decision. He would not be an actor on the world stage, but a priest at God's altar. In 1942, with extraordinary courage, Karol knocked on the doors of the Archbishop of Krakow's palace, Adam Sapia, and asked to enter the clandestine seminary. It was an extremely dangerous decision. If discovered, he would be shot. He studied at night, in secret, while continuing to work in the factory during the day. Being a priest in that context meant being a target, a shepherd for a persecuted flock, a bearer of hope in a world of despair. It was a priesthood forged in martyrdom and resistance. Pause. On November 1st, 1946, with the war finally over, Karol Wojtyla was ordained a priest. Poland was free from Nazism, but it was not truly free. The country was now under the domination of the Soviet Union, governed by a communist regime that saw the Catholic Church as its main enemy. Being a priest in that context was no longer an immediate risk of death, but a constant challenge, a life of vigilance, subtle persecution, and a struggle for the soul of the people. Pausing, after deepening his studies in Rome, Father Wojtyla returned to Poland and became a beloved chaplain to university students in Krakow. He was different. He was not a distant priest, confined to the sacristy. He organized hikes, kayaking trips, and ski camps. He didn't just preach from the pulpit. He talked about faith, philosophy, and life's challenges around a bonfire under the stars. He understood that to reach young people whose faith was being attacked by the state's atheistic propaganda, he needed to go where they were, speak their language, and be a friend, not just an authority. At the same time, he was a formidable intellectual. He became a professor of ethics at the Catholic University of Lublin, the only Catholic university still operating in the entire communist bloc. He delved into the study of philosophy, seeking a Christian response to ideologies that tried to reduce human beings to mere cogs in the system. It was during this period that he began to develop the foundations of his thought, focusing on the inherent and inviolable dignity of the human person. His intelligence and pastoral charisma did not go unnoticed. In 1958, to the surprise of many, Pope Pius XII appointed him auxiliary bishop of Krakow. At 38, he was the youngest bishop in Poland. The communist government allowed his appointment, thinking that, as an academic and poet, he would be harmless. It was one of history's greatest miscalculations. As bishop and later as Archbishop of Krakow, he became a master at defending the faith intelligently and strategically. He did not seek direct confrontation, which would have been crushed by the regime's brute force. Instead, he fought a cultural war. He promoted religious processions that became large public manifestations of faith. He fought for years to get permission to build a church in Nałahuta, the model workers' city that the communists had built to be the first godless Polish city. And he won. The consecration of that church was an immense symbolic victory for the people and a humiliating defeat for the regime. In August 1978, the world was surprised by the election of the smiling Pope John Paul I. But his sudden death, just 33 days later, plunged the church into a new conclave. The cardinals were divided. The Cold War was at its peak. The church needed a strong leader, a shepherd who could guide the flock in times of uncertainty. and then the eyes of the world turned to the Cardinal of Krakow, Karol Wojtyla, a man who knew communism from the inside, a pastor who had fought against tyranny with the weapons of faith and culture. On October 16, 1978, after 8 ballots, he was elected. The first non-Italian pope in 455 years, the first Slavic pope in history. Appearing on the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica, he captivated the world with his humility, asking them to correct him if he made mistakes in Italian, and with a message that would become the motto of his pontificate. Be not afraid. Open indeed. Throw open the doors to Christ. Pause. Less than a year later, in June 1979, John Paul II did what seemed impossible. He returned to his homeland, communist Poland. The atheistic government, fearing his influence, tried to limit his visit, but they could not contain the human avalanche. 11 million Poles, a third of the nation, took to the streets to see their most illustrious son. In Victory Square, in Warsaw, before more than 1 million people, he did not give a political speech. He offered a prayer, a plea that echoed like thunder. And I cry out, I, a son of the Polish land, and also I, Pope John Paul II, cry out from the depths of this millennium. Let the Holy Spirit descend and renew the face of the earth. Pause. Of this land, those words were a spark in a powder keg. The Polish people, who for decades had lived under fear and oppression, realized they were not alone. They were millions. They had an identity. They had faith. A year later, the Solidarity Trade Union was born, led by Lech Walesa, a movement of 10 million workers who, inspired by the Pope's visit, began to peacefully challenge the regime. The courage of one man had awakened the courage of a nation. As Walesa himself would later say, 50% of the fall of the Berlin Wall belongs to John Paul II. Pause. John Paul II's courage in challenging the Soviet Empire, however, came at a terrible price. On May 13, 1981, during the general audience in St. Peter's Square, the Pope was moving through the crowd in his open Pope-mobile. It was a festive day, the anniversary of the first apparition of Our Lady of Fatima. He smiled, blessed, held children. Suddenly, at 5:19 p.m., the sound of 2 gunshots broke the joy of the square. The Turkish terrorist Mehmet Ali Aka, a professional assassin, fired at close range. One of the bullets hit the Pope in the abdomen, piercing his intestine and colon. The other hit his finger and arm. The white Pope, now stained with blood, collapsed. He lost almost 3/4 of his blood and was rushed to Gemelli Polyclinic. The surgery lasted more than 5 hours. The whole world held its breath, praying for his life. Doctors would later say that his survival was a miracle. The bullet had passed millimeters from the main aorta artery. If it had hit it, death would have been instantaneous. While recovering, the Pope read the third secret of Fatima, which described the vision of a bishop dressed in white being killed by gunshots. He had no doubts. The date of the assassination attempt, May 13th, was the same as the first apparition. He was convinced that his life had been spared by the intercession of the Virgin Mary. It was then that he uttered the phrase that would become famous. It was one hand that fired, but another hand guided the bullet. As a sign of gratitude, a year later he traveled to Fatima and consecrated the world to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. One of the bullets that hit him was later embedded in the crown of the statue of the Virgin. But the most extraordinary act was yet to come. On Christmas 1983, John Paul II went to Rebibbia prison in Rome and sat in the cell with the man who tried to kill him. He spoke with Ali Aka for over 20 minutes. The content of the conversation was never fully revealed, but in the end, the world saw the image of forgiveness in its purest form. The Pope not only forgave his attacker, but treated him with the dignity of a child of God. It was a living lesson from the Gospel, a testimony that no encyclical could teach. John Paul II once said he would like to be remembered as the Pope of the family, and he dedicated an immense part of his pontificate to deepening the beauty of God's plan for human love, marriage, and family. In an era of great confusion about sexuality, he offered the world one of the most profound and revolutionary teachings of his pontificate, the theology of the body. Between 1979 and 1984, in 129 Wednesday audiences, the Pope developed a detailed catechesis on the meaning of the human body. He invited us to return to the beginning, before sin, to understand why God created us as man and woman. He explained that our bodies are not a prison for the soul, but a visible sign of an invisible reality. The body, in its masculinity and femininity, reveals the mystery of God, which is a communion of love. He taught that the body has a language. Through the body, we express love, self-giving, and communion. In marriage, when a man and a woman unite, they are not just performing a biological act, they are expressing a profound spiritual reality. The theology of the body is a radically positive vision of human sexuality. It opposes both the mentality that sees the body as an object of selfish pleasure and that which sees it as something dirty or sinful. For John Paul II, the body is sacred because it was created by God to be a gift. He teaches us to see the other person not as an object to use, but as a gift to be loved and respected in their dignity. It is a vision that calls for purity, not as a denial of sexuality, but as the affirmation of its true and beautiful purpose, authentic love and self-giving. John Paul II's holiness, lived in every act of his pontificate, was confirmed by God through miracles. The first, which opened the doors for his beatification, was the healing of Sister Marie Simon-Pierre, a French nun who, ironically, suffered from the same disease that afflicted the Pope in his later years, Parkinson's disease. In 2005, 2 months after John Paul II's death, Sister Marie's illness had advanced to a debilitating point. She could barely write or walk. Her community began to intensely pray for the intercession of the deceased Pope. On the night of June 2nd, after writing John Paul II's name with great difficulty, she went to bed. The next morning, she woke up completely cured. Doctors could not explain it. Science stopped where faith began. Of great. The second miracle, which sealed his canonization, happened on the other side of the world, in Costa Rica. Floribeth Mora suffered from an inoperable cerebral aneurysm. Doctors sent her home, saying she had only a month to live. Desperate, she and her family clung to prayer, asking for John Paul II's intercession. On May 1, 2011, the exact day the Pope was beatified in Rome, Floribeth watched the ceremony on television. From her bed, she heard a voice telling her, "Arise, be not afraid." She got up, completely cured. Subsequent examinations showed that the aneurysm had disappeared without any medical explanation. The miracle was so clear and documented that it paved the way for the world to finally call Karol Wojtyla a saint. His legacy lives not only in miracles but in the hearts of millions. He was the Pope who asked forgiveness for the Church's errors, who dialogued with Jews and Muslims, who defended the dignity of life from beginning to end. And above all, he was the Pope of the youth. He was not afraid to challenge them to be saints, to swim against the current. He created World Youth Days, the largest gathering of young people on the planet, an explosion of faith and joy that continues to transform lives to this day. In his last years, the world saw God's athlete become frail. The body that skied and climbed mountains now trembled, bent by illness. But even in his weakness, he taught his last and perhaps most powerful lesson: the dignity of suffering lived with faith. He showed the world that a person's worth is not in what they can do, but in who they are. On April 2, 2005, he departed for the Father's house. At his funeral, a sign in the crowd summarized everyone's feeling: Santo subito, sainthood now. St. John Paul II's life teaches us that forgiveness is stronger than hatred, that faith can move mountains and tear down walls, and that the courage of one man can inspire the world. May his example help us to live as he lived, without fear, and to open our hearts to Christ.